Bienvenidas,
Right,
Agnès,
welcome, Agnès
Jorge, a
and
quien
Jorge,
les he invitado a que nos
who have
activen esa
been
capacidad
invited so
para
that they can
maravillarnos, ese
switch
espacio
on
para
our
el
capacity to
reencantamiento.
feel at
En
awe, to
primer
feel
lugar, a Agnès
re-enchanted.
Spiquel,
Agnès
mi gran hermana,
Spiquel, my
a
dearest
quien
sister,
me regala la posibilidad de
who
trabajar con
gives
ella
me
estas
the
últimas
wonderful
ediciones. Gracias a
possibility of
ella,
working with
pues
her during
construyo esta
these last
programación, así que
editions.
muchas gracias
Thanks to your
realmente,
help, I
Agnès,
can build
por
up this
todo lo que
wonderful
haces por
program.
este
Thank you
proyecto,
so
por todo lo
much
que nos das
for your
a
help,
nivel de
your
tu gran
support
conocimiento sobre la obra de
towards
Carrie,
this, creating
de
these
realmente vinculárnoslo
wonderful
con todas las
editions,
personas también que
thanks
nos
to your
acompañan
great
cada edición.
expertise on the camusian
Y,
work. Thank you, Agnès. Merci, vraiment.
y Jorge,
And
cuyo
Jorge,
universo, ¿no?, se construye
whose
en esa
universe
intersección
is
entre
built in this
literatura, memoria,
crossroads of
tecnología,
literature,
crítica
memory,
cultural,
technology,
y que busca
cultural
iluminarnos, ¿no?, en esas
um,
zonas de sombra del mundo contemporáneo,
commentary,
en esa
who wants
mercantilización
to
de la cultura, de
talk
la
about the
vigilancia digital, de la pérdida de sentido,
digital world, the
pero
loss
lo
of
hace siempre
sense,
con una
this
lucidez que
mercantilization
no
of
cae en
this
ese
digital
nihilismo, ¿no?,
world,
sino que
not
apuesta por ese
falling on the
pensamiento
trap
crítico
of
que tanto
nihilism,
reivindicamos aquí desde
rather
las Trovadas,
defending the critical
entendiendo el arte
thought
como esa
that we so much
resistencia y un
defend in our
conocimiento como
Trovadas,
forma de libertad.
defending
Con ellos
art
dos
as a
os dejo.
form of liberty and knowledge. You have the floor, dear friends.
Merci. Merci Sandra.
Thank
Merci
you.
pour tes mots.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for your words. Thank you for this invitation, coming over and over again, revisiting this amazing space and seeing. Oops, sorry, give me a sec. Okay. I don't like machines. I was talking about enchantment. After these words we've heard this morning, it's true that when we talk about re-enchantment again, maybe it has something. If there is enchantment and disenchantment and re-enchantment, okay? Enchantment, of course, it has a marvelous dimension, but in everyday conversation, it can have a weakened meaning when it's a passive form. Je suis enchantée de vous voir, we say in French. I'm very happy. It's much stronger in the pronominal and active forms. We would say that the child is enchanted by the images we say, or the presence of the loved one enchants the world. It's a question of saying in active, right? I perceive the marvelous in reality. I'm enchanted by the world. So the world, the real is wonderful. It's the place where the marvelous can emerge, right? Now, disenchantment, this is a disillusioned lucidity, this view of the world that has become impossible. The verbal form only exists in the passive form. For example, I am disenchanted with everything, or the world has become disenchanted. This was the very experience by Romanticism in France at the beginning of the 19th century. After the revolution, poets looked at the fresh perspective of nature and the history of humanity. After the current failures to prolong the revolution, the loss of hope in poetry itself. Let's think of the great critical Paul Bellechou, who could design this concept in the second Romanticism as the school of the disenchantment. The ideal has become inaccessible. Reality is ugly. People only thought of money and business, and poetry is no longer in touch with reality. And even more so these days, art and culture, I believe, have become objects of commerce. And now let's talk about re-enchantment. Based on this experience of disenchantment, how can we rediscover our view of the world? A resolutely active form of the verb. It's about recreating that gaze on the world and on life to detect the marvel of it. I love Baudelaire, the poet, and he no longer wanted to shut himself away at night in his attic under the river in Paris. And he wanted to rather be in the suburbs, in the life of the city. And it's very meaningful, his static, Le Soleil, the sun. It's the first poem of the Tableau Parisien, the Parisian. When he says, along the old suburb where hangs the hovels, the shutters shelter of secret lust, when the cruel sun strikes with redoubled strokes, on the town, on the fields, on the roofs, and the wheat, I'll practice with my fantastic fencing alone, sniffing out rimming hazards in every corner, stumbling over words and over cobblestones, sometimes bumping into verses long dreamt of. This beautiful poem can be found, you see, talking about the cobblestones of cities, the marvelous springing up everywhere. It's all about the way we gaze, our regards, our looks. Works of art are thus a powerful aid to this process because they are themselves the result of a process of re-enchantment of the part of the artist. When I look at a painting or a photograph, I sharpen and refine my gaze. It's this re-enchantment by the artist, you see, and by looking at this photograph, I refine my gaze. I try to enter in the painting, and by doing so, I enter into the artist's project. What has he or she captured of this reality? What did they want to show? In the case of literature, the same process is mediated by words. This is particularly clear in poetry. I go to the words, I let the images dwell in me, and a philosopher of lucidity to flush out of the absurd and keep the perception of it intact, even in the continuation of the philosophical journey. Grenier, when he republished his book in 1958, he reflected on this term. In 1933, he was only 20. He read the Îles, the Isles, by his master and friend Grenier. He was very impressed. And in 1958, as we said, a few decades afterwards, Grenier republished this book in an expanded edition, and then Camus wrote a preface. And he became famous, as we know, and he wrote the preface, the Îles, as he wrote about this 25 years, and he said that after the enchantment of his childhood and youth, which was nourished by the sea, the light, the faces, Grenier's text comes, and I quote, to say in an inimitable language that these appearances were beautiful, but that they had to perish, and that we then had to love them desperately. In short, the islands had just introduced us to this enchantment. We had discovered culture. The rest of this beautiful text explores this enchantment and the way Camus combined it with his experience of reality in all its form. I quote again. Grenier reminded us at the same time of the imperishable flavor and transience of the transport, the moment of yes that we had experienced obscurely. We understood our sudden melancholy at the same time. This enchantment, linked to the feeling of precariousness, so strong in Camus because of his illness, is present in his first texts. And the title of the central essay, in L'envers à l'endroit, between the yes and no, suggests it. He doesn't oscillate between enchantment and disenchantment, but he experiences both intensely at the same time, as close as inseparable as the back and front of a page. And that's where I see the search for something like a camusian re-enchantment is the very first fact of becoming aware of the proximity between enchantment and disenchantment and finding the term to express it. We should reread it in its entirety, the magnificent ending of the last essay of Nos, entitled Le Désert, where it's not a question of the desert of sand, but the solitude imposed or chosen of modern man. Solitude, where at the very heart of beauty, he experiences the ephemeral and his own finitude. From this comes a song, I quote, a song without hope. And this is where Camus, many years later, explores explicitly in the preface of The Islands. I quote, I needed to be reminded of mystery and the sacred, of the finitude of man, of impossible love, so that one day I could return to my natural gods with less arrogance. So I don't owe Granier any certainties that he couldn't or wouldn't give. On the contrary, I owe him a doubt that I will never end and that has prevented me, for example, from being a humanist in the sense that we understand it today. I mean, a man blinded by short-sighted certainties. This trembling in the islands, from the first day, in any case, I admired it and I wanted to love it. End of quote. The re-enchantment doesn't have the same tone as the initial enchantment, less arrogance and certainty, more doubts, and this very beautiful observation of a trembling, as if in front of something that amazes us and that we know is going to stop, even if we would so much like it to last. There's something on this in two texts from the 50s that I'd like to mention quickly now. The first one is entitled L'Enchantement à corde, the enchantment in chord. In June 53, Camus spent a few days in the village of Chord, today called Corde-sur-Ciel, in the area of Tarn, in the Occitanie. He was invited there by a friend from Algiers, Claire Baer. In 1954, she published a beautiful book about the village where she now lived. Camus agreed to write a preface. Here we have a few extracts. You travel for years without reality, knowing what you're looking for. You wander through the noise, entangled in desires of repentance. And then suddenly, you arrived in one of those or two, three places that patiently wait for each of us in this world. You get there, and your heart finally falls silent, and you discover that you've arrived. The traveler who looks out of the summer night from the terrace at Corde knows that they need to go farther, and that if he wishes, the beauty here, day after day, will take away all solitude. Light veils the sand from the night sky toward the mists of the valley, mingling with them for a moment, then sinking lower. The smoke from the earth, one by one, rises again and finally dissipates under the clear stars. The silence becomes vast and light over the old deserted city. I didn't have the intelligence to wait there some longer. With this passion in the beautiful pace of Corde, I owe my encounter there and one of the most beautiful regrets of my life, for therein lies the enchantment of Corde. Everything is beautiful, even regret. End of quote. The trembling of hopeless beauty is certainly best summed up in Retour à Tipaza, written in 1952 and published in L'été, the summer, in 1958. In this short essay, Camus explores his desire to rediscover the acceleration of Tipaza after having lived through the harsh years of war, and for him, exile far from the light of his homeland. He recalls a first abortive attempt on a rainy December day. Nothing happened. He tried again several years later, and this time the miracle happened. he discovered his sense of wonder. I quote, "It seemed to me that I finally returned to port for a moment and that this moment would never end." But that he understands later goes much farther. It's not a question of coming back to Tipasa indefinitely, choosing days of good weather to forget the ugliness of the world. It's a question of keeping intact with oneself a freshness, a source of joy, loving the day that escapes injustice, and returning to the battle with this conquered light. End of quote. And we all know the famous line, I quote, "I was finally learning that I had an invincible summer inside of me." But all too often we forget that this is not the end of the essay. The last two pages, which are less triumphant, say that this is a secret that has to be relearned over and over again until death. And what is desired is not a death in Tipasa. It will be, I quote, "to go and lie down in the valley under the same light and learn one last time what I know." End of quote. It is this text that, in my opinion, best expresses Camus' re-enchantment. So, to conclude, re-enchantment is knowing how to detect beauty, even in places where it is least expected, and above all, to know how to greet it. Rimbaud concluded the essential section of these illuminations with these words, I quote, "It happened. Today I know how to salute beauty." End of quote. No doubt you can only become a true artist if you have the secret of re-enchantment. But artists, each with their own material, offer us the possibility of transforming our way of saying, and therefore the world, as well as our inner world. So I fully agree with them. Thank you very much.
Hola, bona tarda. Gràcies per
Hi,
la invitació.
good afternoon. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be in Menorca again. I'm seeing it's quite late before lunch, so in this circumstance, we are living a moment when our stomach is enchanting us, and I have the duty, together with Agnès, to re-enchant you so that you stay here over half an hour before lunch. When Sandra generously invited me to speak here today, I thought about several topics. The first thing that came to my mind was a topic I'm working currently on, because in recent years I've co-written and I've thought about artificial intelligence and the paradox that we are living a historical time, extraordinary times. We've created a type of a technology we've been dreaming about at least since Mary Shelley published Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. So with that technology that is capable of translating the language of proteins or to make sense of old and long dead languages that had no translation. So we should be marveling and enchanted. Instead, we are disenchanted and really suspicious, highly suspicious about the powers of this new technology, with a collective way of opposing it. That is quite astonishing, because I insist we've been awaiting it for years, for decades, if not for centuries. So I was thinking about how we can re-enchant ourselves with AI and contemporary technologies, generally speaking, those small robots that can even travel through our guts, our intestines, new synth materials, or or the outer world exploration, but everything is imbued and surrounded by suspicion and disenchantment. I want us to reflect collectively about some figures, leading outstanding figures of the 20th century that can lead us to thinking about disenchantment. In particular, there are two iconic figures in the Italian cartel of the world of art and education, pedagogy, that we can invoke collectively to help us somehow to think about our current times in a more optimistic way. On the one hand, Maria Montessori and Louis Bonari, two great pedagogists, educators. Bonari was also designer and artist, creator of the famous pre-library, pre-books for very small children that can hardly read, but instead can start playing with books as a format, as a language, educating them in a way that they can interpret the world through books. So the idea of childhood as a laboratory, as a way of playing a game, enabling us to imagine, to think. So books and labs as an interface with the world since childhood. As we've discovered that all technologists that invented the current world, Zuckerberg and Bezos, Jeff Bezos, and all their acolytes take their children to Montessori schools with no screens at all, it was important to invoke those figures and to rethink together. Another possible topic for today was the project the European artist is working on, but Francis Alice. He comes from Mexico. You might know this artist from conceptual art performances, the fact of moving a dune, a mountain with hundreds of volunteers. So for some years, as we saw in the Vienna Biennale, the artist is playing with children's games. He's documented all over the world child games in the playground, on the street, to make a topography, a global mapping of play worldwide. First of all, he records everything. He documents and creates some animations, beautiful videos and clips. And thanks to the magic of contemporary art, they enable to reconnect ourselves to our former selves when we were children. These are like substructures of the Jungian unconscious and collective unconscious, because we all used to play in a similar way when we were children, when we were little. And this leads us once and again back to childhood. And I suspected, and I've seen I wasn't wrong, that childhood would be invoked during these Trobades, and I would be speaking after several and people that might have mentioned it. So I propose a new way of thinking about it, not through childhood, but through re-enchantment, because even though we regret it, nobody can go back to childhood times. This is paradise lost by excellence, and there is no way to recover it. Even science taught us why, apparently, during our adolescence times, the biochemical mechanisms, those deep mechanisms that take place inside our body, are quite similar, even the same as what separates a worm from a butterfly. So when we were little, that child, we can, well, establish a similarity with a worm. So this is something that is never there. So adolescence is a place we, in fact, can come back to. So adolescence starts when we are 12, 13 years old, and it concluded when between 18 and 20. Nowadays it takes longer, but this is quite a prolonged period of time. Is a bridge, a transition, a mutation, a transformation between childhood and adulthood. Maybe, perhaps, in adolescence we can find some traces that lead us to re-enchantment, to reconnection, to recover, reclaim elements of that marvel that has been so frequently invoked today, that is so characteristic of children. It has to do with imagination, play, playfulness, creating other possible worlds, more utopic, less dystopic, and possibilities and worlds. So if you allow me, I will briefly tackle my own adolescence, my own youth. For years, I insisted on this topic in my articles, in my books, in my lectures. I wanted to be a private detective. When I was a child, that's why I wrote this world, like this inquiry, this detective inquiry, to understand the sense of bookshops. In recent years, I made some podcasts about science, technology, and culture. When I was a child, I always wanted to become a scientist. There was a game called Mineralova. It was you played with minerals and chemionova, chemistry. You could do chemistry at home. I mean, humbly, moderately. But I never spoke about about the games I played at when I was young, in my adolescence. And this is even more important. It has defined and shaped the person I am compared to those science games or my frustrated vocation of becoming a private detective. When I was young, during the adolescence, there are mainly three healthy, playful options. One is sports, with its advantages and disadvantages. Secondly, video games. You can play video games also with advantages and disadvantages. In fact, it's really interesting to observe how adolescents during the COVID pandemic, many of them could survive by playing online games. This allowed them to keep in contact with friends. Many of them have even a positive memory of the pandemic times, thanks to that saved them. Another way of playing in those times, when I was young, you used to play role games. For those of you that are not familiar with role games, first of all, it's a book that describes a world. In the first role game is very famous, Dungeons and Dragons. So when you opened that book, that game, a world was described to you with topography, dragons, different types of characters, and a series of rules. You had to learn them, and together with a sheet, with some instructions, you created a certain character following a logic, and each of the players had a character and had to act, to behave as if he or she was that character. It was followed by Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and when I was young, there were many dozens of games, and I visited a center, a community center in my neighborhood to play those role games, first as a player, assuming those roles, taken on those fantastic roles, science fiction, there was espionage, police inquiries, different types of worlds. And with the passing of time, I became a great fan, so that I became a master. A master means a person that reads the world, understands the world, invents a new project, an adventure, and shares it with the rest of the players. That master is physically detached from players with a screen. So they have the dices and the notes. So you throw the dices and decide what happens based on what you get from the dice, the result. So you decide whether it will be sunny or rainy. So you have enemies, friends, and foes. There are physical or even verbal struggles. You can, use tools such as persuasion. So they use seduction through the dicing, and you do the same, and love can emerge after that. run that game. So I was behind the screen managing those worlds, and together with some friends in my hometown in Mataró in Catalonia, I remember beautiful evenings playing long games of role games. Some of them took years to finish. I mean, every Friday evening we would play from 9 p.m. to 2, 3 in the morning, playing role games for 3 consecutive years. That means I had less healthy, I mean, habits. And of course, on Saturday night, there I was at a disco having my gin tonics and my, my drinks. But there was a space for imagination, for exercising imaginations. And well, I started writing when I was very young, so I published some short stories about science fiction, but also published some role games. I wrote 10 pages with schemes, with drawings. I sent it with a diskette. There was no internet. I printed it, and magically, after 3, 4 months, it was published, and I got it back. I used a floppy disk to send it to the publishing house, and then got it back. So after that time of my life, I finished my university studies. I got a degree in humanities at the University of Barcelona and started my PhD, my postdoctoral time. I was 25 years old at that time, and I read a book. I came upon a book written by a friend of mine, the philosopher Eloy Fernández Porta, and it's entitled After Pop. It's a book about what came after pop, that is my time, our time. So Eloy spoke about literature, philosophy, but also about comic strips, science fiction series, TV series, pornography, all sorts of topics. So I started up a slow process of thinking. I realized that during all my university studies, I only read high literature. Jorge Semprún, Walter Benjamin, Susan Sontag, Primo Levi, all those great scholars of contemporary thinking. However, my background was that of role games, superhero comic strips, reading science fiction, etc. So I tried to recover that part of myself. And everything I've written about since then, I did based on creative freedom and without an academic, a scholarly vocation. That was my express decision of writing books with not such a long list of references, bibliographic references, with a type of uniform language, not with the typical academic language, but with formal freedom, because formal language is very much alike what we read nowadays in ChatGPT. So that was my intent, researching, being aware that essay, novel, literature are creative labs, and every project needs to be unique and different from the others. I'll show 2 examples. This is one called Librerías, bookshops. I wrote it 15 years ago. It's an essay about, bookshops all over the world. One day I realized I had visited the 5 continents, and for I don't know why, but I had visited bookstores in everywhere I visited, every country I visited. So whenever there is a creative project, there is an archive. Paula Ortiz, her readings of Lorca, neighborhood stories, Gaza stories, there is always an archive behind, underlying any meaningful project. So my archive about bookshops, it was massive. Books and boxes and boxes of notes, cards, books I found all over the world. And with that archive, that was the starting point for writing this book. It could have taken the shape of a doctoral thesis, but it's the opposite. I really enjoyed it because I I try a different type of style. I use different metaphors. I ask different questions, and I, well, go through the history of bookstores from ancient Greek to Amazon in the 20th century, 21st century, looking for ways of enchanting and re-enchanting readers with through this important physical space, bookshops, the same as well, libraries and museums are fundamental. But to my surprise, there was no cultural history of bookstores. There was no no book that had compiled the history of bookshops. That's why I decided to write it. The problem of having written several books, I really struggle not to repeat the same formula in my effort to find enchantment. If you do not fall in love, if you are not very much interested in your materials, in the way you do, it's hard you have any meaningful impact. So I try to find stimulating projects and to raise the interest of my readers, and never with the will to trap people. I hate that verb. I don't want to trap my reader, to captivate. No, I want to captivate them. I want them to get inside and outside and get out whenever they wish. But I want to persuade them to feel attracted and interested in what I'm telling. So after drawing some comic strips that were somehow conventional, I came up with an idea. I realized that the life of Abi Barbour, this famous art historian, he said he worked at a library. So this is something he did in the 1920s. This is similar to what Sylvia Beach said. So it was interesting to tell the lives of both. They were parallel lives, so the only way of making sense and have a meaningful project was to use the accordion symbol. That's what we did with Salamandra Graphic. We told the life of Sylvia Beach on the one hand, on the one side, through this comic, this cartoon, this comic strip, using this language. From the very moment she's born, when she founds Shakespeare and Company, she meets James Joyce, then writes Ulysses until she dies. On the other side of this accordion, those stories can be read in parallel. I told the life of Abi Barbour, not with the same language, but through collage, as a technique, in a playful way, playing with the languages they used. So this accordion this folding book was created as a way of connecting concept and form. Interestingly, when I opened the book, you said, wow, you were, well, astonished. That means that magic does exist, and you can achieve it just in paper, with paper and cardboard. You don't need AI, video games, and stuff. So the key, lies, of course, in thinking, of course, that childhood is marvelous. I observe my two kids, I enchant myself and re-enchant, but maybe everything revolves around adolescence, youth. It's the way, the bridge between childhood and adulthood, and we can come back to adolescence, to our youthful times. And while I was speaking, I realized that this book is a master's screen for a role game. So that reminded me of when I was 18. Thank you.
peux me permettre de parler tout de suite, je voudrais dire que
If you allow me to say some words,
j'ai un fils qui a adoré les jeux de rôle et j'ai vécu
Eh,
là-dedans du point de vue par rapport à mon fils.
I have a friend who was passionate about role games, but he didn't write such interesting books, so magic, full of magic. But thank you so much.
Regardez ce thème, on ne peut pas faire des
Because,
choses aussi différentes.
I mean,
C'est
looking
un enchantement.
how
C'est magnifique.
different approaches we had to the topic. Thank you so much for your presentation.
De hecho, escuchándote,
In
Agnès,
fact,
yo también soy
listening to you, Agnès,
admirador
I'm a great
de Baudelaire.
admirer and reader of
Pensaba
Baudelaire,
precisamente en esto mismo,
and I
¿no?
was
O sea,
thinking
toda la
exactly
modernidad
of
y
that.
la edad contemporánea
If you look at
como
modernity,
épocas
modern
exactas
times, and
llegan
contemporary
inundadas
times,
del
a different way of,
romanticismo y
I
creo
mean,
que
they were
Baudelaire es el
ushered
autor
with a different way of looking
de
at
poesía
things,
sobre la ciudad. O sea,
romanticism.
Baudelaire se da
And
cuenta
Baudelaire
que
has
la ciudad no ha sido
poems
poetizada,
about the
se puede convertir
city.
en
And
poesía.
he realizes that the city
Así
hadn't
tenemos a los
been
niños, que son los románticos, y
expressed
Baudelaire,
with the language of poetry.
ahora somos los adultos.
So nowadays we are adults.
Quizá los adolescentes fueron
Maybe
Lunari
adolescents
o
were
María
Lunari or Maria
los modernos.
Montessori, the moderns.
Entonces, quizás son los adolescentes que nos
So
permiten
maybe
conectar con el
adolescents
romanticismo
will
y su
allow us to
espíritu,
connect
¿no?
with the spirit of
Pensaba en eso, que
romanticism.
conecta con lo que yo
I was
comentaba
reflecting
cuando
on
te
this that
escuchaba, ¿no?
has
Todos
a
debemos
direct
aprender todavía
connection
del
with
romanticismo
what
o de
both
Baudelaire.
said. We have a lot to learn still from Baudelaire,
Et de ce fil qui mène
obviously,
à Apollinaire, si
and
on continue
from
la
that
poésie.
guiding
Mais
thread
je
linking to
considérais, moi, c'est
Apollinaire
de retrouver
and
ces
staying
termes
in
d'enchantement et de
poetry,
désenchantement.
I
J'ai
was
comme-
really
ils sont
surprised to
conservés.
find these terms. Enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment. I couldn't believe that I could find references in all these authors, in the right and the wrong, these less known texts that tackle these topics. I mean, they are absolutely fascinating for me. In fact, for me, one of the moments of his life I most enjoy is his childhood and how important his teacher was for him, a key figure in his life. So, interestingly, each micro life enables us to understand, to explain the topic we are speaking about, your life, my life, Camus's life, each of us. That's why I was interested in finding an interface, the bridge, this interdimensional portal we can use to try and understand how we can re-enchant ourselves in these times, full of disenchantment. Yes, because in other lives, I'm thinking about myself and I'm not going to elaborate on it. But of course, we can wonder and ask about our own lives by using this approach under this lens. It is true that when we ask ourselves what happened, when did re-enchantment appeared and took place in my life, yeah, I'll start asking questions to my adolescent self. I think it's something we should all do. We start doing. Are there any questions from the audience, please? You can raise your hand. And so we are enchanted again with the prospects, what awaits us. I would very much want to thank you both for your proposals. You spoke about the need to reconnect, to act as a bridge to what will come in the afternoon after lunch, and to this interface between the morning and the afternoon, the need to reconnect. I'm sure that last evening, we reconnected with our childhood, and after you, Jorge, will reconnect with our youth and adolescent times. So the need to reconnect is always there. Thanks to both of you. We are immensely